Manius Acilius Glabrio, Consul 191 BCE. Upon becoming the first in his gens to attain the consulship, Manius Acilius Glabrio catapulted himself and his descendants into perennial relevance. The Senate selected him to conduct a war in Greece against the Seleucid Empire. In theory, the Seleucid Empire was the mightiest power the Romans had ever faced, and Antiochus the Great was perhaps the most able leader to dare stand in the Republic's path. Glabrio, taking his opponent very seriously, entered Greece with a larger force and far sooner than Antiochus had anticipated. Through vigorous campaigning and capitalizing on a lack of enthusiasm for the Seleucids and their Aetolian allies, Glabrio quickly destroyed months of hard work. Cornering Antiochus's much smaller army, Glabrio found himself tasked with dislodging a Greek army from the famous path at Thermopylae. Something of a dream come true for any ancient boy reared on tales of glory. Emerging victorious in this struggle, Glabrio had cemented his place in Roman history, and he had set the stage for a Roman victory against the last truly formidable foe the Republic would ever face. However, the aftermath of his historic victory would sow the seeds of political rivalries which would be his bane for the rest of his life. At Thermopylae, Glabrio allowed his legate, Cato the Elder, to return to Rome to announce the victory. Cato did just that, except that he claimed credit, and this led to an intense feud. During his mop-up operations against the Aetolians, Glabrio's harsh punishments really drew the ire of Titus Quinctius Flamininus, who saw himself as the ultimate authority on Greek affairs. Thus Glabrio found himself on the outs with Flamininus and engaged in outright enmity with Cato. Returning to Rome, Glabrio triumphed in magnificent fashion, and then he attempted to ride his momentum into the censorship of 189. However, one of his legates accused him of misappropriating some of the spoils from the campaign. Combined with the rival candidate Cato's decision to bow out, to avoid any implication of wrongdoing, Glabrio's bid collapsed, and this effectively ended his active office-holding career. Yet, he would continue to contribute to Roman cultural life, drawing on the practices of the Hellenistic monarchs to craft a golden statue of himself. This practice of creating golden statues quickly caught on and became a normal part of elite Roman life. Despite not being the preeminent man of his age, he was, after all, a contemporary of Scipio Africanus, Glabrio still achieved enough acclaim that his descendants would continue to hold high office in the Senate until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE. This is the story of a man who, in his own way, gained as much of a gilded reputation at Thermopylae Pass as King Leonidas of Sparta. Manius Acilius Glabrio was the scion of what was at the time a minor plebeian gens. They had only become a senatorial family in the time of his grandfather Lucius. Both his grandfather Lucius and his father Gaius were members of the Senate, and they also happened to be the first attested members of gens Aquilia. However, neither one of them appear to have been particularly accomplished. In fact, we don't really know anything about their careers except that they were indeed members of the Senate. So they were low-profile backbenchers, people who probably only held a low-ranking office such as quaestor or perhaps even tribune. During the Second Punic War, much of the Senate was wiped out, and so this led to many opportunities for advancement for men who otherwise might have struggled to reach the senior offices. And this appears to have been something that really aided Glabrio's elevation. And so, in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, he at least could claim to have been in the Senate prior to the war's outbreak, or at least his family had been in the Senate prior to the war's outbreak, and so he now was no longer really disadvantaged when it came to his pedigree. And once he will have his career, he will cement a first name of choice for the family, and that will be the name Manius. So in the future, most of the members of the Acilius Glabrio line and the various other Aquilia lines will favor the name Manius. As for the origin of the name Glabrio, this appears to be derived from the Latin word glaber, which means smooth or slick. And this could refer to a number of things. It could refer to baldness, or it could refer to a somewhat eccentric practice in the Roman imagination of removing body hair. So it could refer to either of those things, or perhaps it's meant more metaphorically in that Glabrio was a smooth, silky politician. We simply don't really know. Our first encounter with a young Glabrio occurs in 209, and this year there was a severe grain shortage not only in Italy, but throughout the majority of the Mediterranean. And according to the Greek historian Polybius, who wrote about 50 or 60 years later, the only place not affected by this grain shortage was Egypt. Egypt, of course, was one of the great breadbaskets of the Mediterranean. And so, with little grain to be had, and Italy still ravaged by war, since Hannibal was still on the loose in the countryside, the Romans decided to send Glabrio along with another senator named Marcus Atilius on a mission bearing gifts to Ptolemy IV Philopator and his queen Cleopatra. And the request, of course, was that the Roman people would like a shipment of grain. Unfortunately, Polybius doesn't tell us whether this mission succeeded or not. However, we can kind of intuit that perhaps it failed, given that he lists the price of grain in 209 as 15 drachma for a mere medimnos of grain. And a medimnos, of course, is a Greek measure. We can think of it as something like a bushel. So this would be approximately 15 days worth of wages for just one bushel of grain. So this would be quite disastrously high for your average Roman. And so we can see that Glabrio's mission was quite important, and one has to wonder whether or not he pulled it off. But again, most likely he failed just based on that price point. After Glabrio's time as an envoy to Egypt, we don't see him again for another 18 years, and by this point he's become consul. We have to assume that he must have been a clever and talented politician to compete in the 190s, which was perhaps the most star-studded era of Roman politics ever, because you had a lot of young, energetic, and extremely accomplished politicians who were very talented commanders and had plenty of experience from the Second Punic War. As for the conflict that Glabrio would inherit, I think it's worth looking at the background of said conflict. So, during the early 190s, from about 200 to 197 or 196, the Romans engaged in what is known as the Second Macedonian War. In many ways, this was a war of revenge because Philip V had jumped into the Second Punic War after Cannae. And so the Romans wanted to get even, and they reduced Macedonian power in the course of this conflict. They also set up a number of alliances in Greece, and for the most part it appears they were trying to achieve a kind of balance of power over there, but they weren't really interested in staying long term. The Romans at this time didn't think that they could expand that far. And actually this is a fairly consensus opinion at this point that the Romans actually did not have territorial designs on Greece in the 190s. Now, from Antiochus's perspective, this was a golden opportunity. So he had actually already been campaigning in Thrace as early as the Second Macedonian War, and he had been communicating with the Roman consuls who led that conflict, and he had convinced them that his ambitions stopped in Thrace, and he was merely trying to restore the empire as it had existed under Seleucus I Nicator. So he made it out as an ancestral project. And from the Roman perspective, Antiochus had been on the throne now for over 20 years. He had had a hard, long career. It would make sense that he might want to consolidate his gains at this point. But instead, Antiochus remained as ambitious as ever. And what he saw when the Romans left was an opening, because the Romans, by breaking the power of Philip, had left Greece wide open from his perspective. At the same time, the Aetolians, who had helped the Romans very much during the First Macedonian War, which was the side theater of the Second Punic War, they felt like they had not been adequately rewarded by the Romans in the aftermath of the Second Macedonian War, and they also felt like the Romans had used them. So they were bitter, and they actually invited Antiochus in. So Antiochus's thinking is that because the Romans clearly do not want to occupy Greece, that although they will be alarmed by him invading Greece, if he does it quickly enough, they'll simply accept it. because they don't want to get dragged back into this mess. And so he advanced with a small army of about 10,000 men, and his hope was that if he just pulled this off in the middle of the winter, that the Romans would simply decide, okay, it is what it is, we might as well just accept it and move on. So this was Antiochus's thinking. However, the Romans were sufficiently alarmed by his actions that they decided they had to take action and that they needed to aid their allies in the Greek world. Antiochus was correct that the Romans were a bit hesitant in terms of deciding what to do. There were a number of senators who were against intervention. However, in the end, enough of them were in favor of intervention that that is what the Senate decided to do. And the key factor here, aside from the ambitions of a number of young senior commanders who wanted to use this large pool of veterans before they aged out, aside from that sort of human factor, there's also the connections that many of the Roman commanders had made with the leading powers of the Hellenistic East. And the most influential ally at the time was Eumenes II of Pergamon. He had inherited the throne of Pergamon during the Second Macedonian War, and he had been a zealous and active ally of the Romans as they fought against Philip V. So, the Romans wanted to preserve him. They felt like he was a useful tool in limiting the powers of the more ambitious Seleucids and Antigonid Macedonians. They also had a request from Rhodes, which had also provided a lot of useful service in the last war, and they also had a request from the cultural megapower of Athens. So between those sources and then some other sources of pressure that didn't make it into our written sources, the Romans decided that the best course of action was to intervene and aid their Greek allies. Now, perhaps anticipating that the Romans would come in and might punish people who sided against them, the Greeks were hesitant when it came to backing Antiochus. And this might be for a couple of reasons. One is that earlier the Romans had acted relatively justly as far as the Greeks were concerned. The Romans had treated them pretty fairly. They had broken the hold of Macedonia, and they had not really punished any of the other Greek powers that severely. By the same token, one of the major mistakes Antiochus made is that he was an ally of the Aetolians, who were actually deeply unpopular outside of their own territory. And that's because the Aetolians, in part at least, relied economically upon raiding as a source of income. So many of the communities in Greece had been subject to Aetolian raids in the past. So the fact that Antiochus was backing the Aetolians was a couple of strikes against him, even though in general he had a positive reputation. And so the Romans knew that if they were to intervene in the Greek world, they could count on having more support from the locals than their enemies. That being said, Antiochus's gamble was probably worth it, because there was at least a 50% chance the Romans would decide to just let him have Greece. Or if not a 50% chance, then a pretty solid chance. So this was a gamble that he probably would have made a second time if he had this to do over again. But, of course, as with all gambles, he didn't know how it would turn out. When it came time to assign the war to one of the consuls, the Senate decided that Manius Acilius Glabrio was the man of the hour. And this was probably a surprise to him, as he most likely assumed that the command would go to his colleague, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, a cousin of Scipio Africanus, and a man who was already quite famous for his jurisprudence. For the most part, the reason why this command went to him rather than to Scipio Nasica most likely boils down to the fact that, aside from Scipio himself, most of the people in the Senate, or at least a pretty good portion of them, wanted to prevent Scipio and his circle from acquiring any more influence. So this was probably a case of choosing what was the lesser of two evils in the eyes of people like Cato and others who undoubtedly pushed for Glabrio. Because of this war being high stakes, because the Seleucid Empire was, in theory at least, the greatest power they'd ever faced, and because this campaign promised to be potentially very hazardous, Glabrio had no trouble whatsoever recruiting top-tier talent as legates. Typically, most of the legates who would sign up for a foreign war were relatively junior men who had not made their name yet, or men who wanted to gain some accolades before they tried to run for higher office. But in this case, the severity of the crisis, or I should say in this case, the opportunities and dangers presented by this war, led to two men who were ex-consuls putting their pride aside and signing up as legates. And those two men were Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder or Cato the Censor, who had been consul back in 195, and Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who had been consul in 194. Both of these men were quite well known. They were also very distinguished veterans of the Second Punic War. It's also worth mentioning that although Cato had been consul already, he was still pretty young at this time. So even though his famous image here shows him as a much older man, we have to imagine a Cato who was probably still under 40. At any rate, with this army full of not only veteran soldiers, but highly experienced and distinguished legates, Glabrio landed at Apollonia in the spring of 191 with 36,000 men, which was not huge by the standards of that era, but it was still a pretty substantial army, and it was certainly larger than what Antiochus and his Aetolian allies could field at the time. Glabrio's landing was very well timed. It appears that Antiochus had thought that even if the Romans did intervene, that it would take them until the summer to arrive in the Greek world, by which time he had hoped to really consolidate his hold and perhaps lure Philip V into an alliance. However, that didn't happen. And in fact, one of the prongs of Glabrio's invasion was led by the praetor Marcus Baebius Tamphilus, and he led his army up north, and Philip, having been humbled thoroughly by the Romans in the past and fearing the ambition of the Seleucids to unify all of the old Hellenistic kingdoms, decided to throw in his lot with the Romans. So Baebius was joined by the still powerful, even if humbled, Macedonian army, and up north they were able to do some damage. Meanwhile, Glabrio's army landed further south and began to campaign as well. And so between these two prongs, the Romans and their allies were able to undo all of the gains that Antiochus had made over the winter. So within a few weeks, everything that Antiochus had achieved over perhaps 6 months was wiped out. Now, Glabrio wanted a field battle. He wanted to win quickly and decisively against Antiochus. He knew that Antiochus would have trouble recovering from a field battle defeat, and so he avoided the fortified city of Demetrios, where the Seleucids had a garrison and fortifications. The Romans chased a general named Amminander of Athemania out of Epirus, and then he took refuge with the Aetolians. So thus far, the campaign was going extremely well, and Glabrio was now trying to locate and confront the army under King Antiochus. As his army massed near the border, now joined by Baebius and by the Macedonians, the Aetolians were spooked because they were afraid of a direct invasion. And so, when Antiochus called upon them to send their men to join him for the decisive battle, they hesitated. They did not want to leave their homeland unprotected, and so they only gave 4,000 men, which means that Antiochus now only had 14,000 men total, and maybe a bit more if we consider other smaller contingents he might have picked up. But certainly he's outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. If we think of the force of 36,000 that Glabrio brought, plus the Macedonians, who would have made that force probably closer to 50,000. So Antiochus now needs to find a place where he can make a stand, and where the numbers of the Romans won't completely and totally swamp him. Antiochus the Great was well aware of his classical Greek history, and so he chose one of the most renowned spots in all of Greece, Thermopylae Pass. However, rather than occupying the main pass, which is the one that the Spartans had defended against the Persians, he instead occupied the infamous Back Pass, the one that Xerxes had utilized to circumvent the Spartans in 480. So this path is even smaller and more hilly. It also meant that it would better offset the Roman numerical edge. Glabrio understood also that this would not be a very good position to attack head-on. And so, from the battle's outset, he decided that he would send his two senior legates on a special mission to circumvent the enemy's defenses and attack from the rear. At the time, none of them had any idea if such a path existed or where it might be. And for the most part, they were going to have to go off path and just trudge through the woods to find the thing. So both Sempronius and Cato were given 2,000 man detachments and sent off to do whatever they could accomplish. In the meantime, Glabrio kept Antiochus' attention by mounting a frontal assault. So this was a bloody, bitter battle. Meanwhile, these other two forces are trying to keep some sort of cohesion going through the woods, looking for a way around to the enemy rear. And the first of the two legates to find something was Cato. Cato marched up a wooded mountain called Calidromon, and then he was able to go from there into the enemy's rear. And although the battle had been pretty evenly fought up to that point, as soon as Cato's men emerged from the woods, this caused a panic in the Seleucid army, and it led to a rout. And in ancient battles, routs are where almost all the casualties occur. And so, of that 14,000-man army that Antiochus III had at the beginning of the battle, only about 500 of the men were able to escape. And so this was a decisive victory. It ended any chance of Antiochus conquering Greece that year, and in fact, he would soon give up altogether on operating in Greece. So this was one of the great victories of an era that had plenty of them, the Middle Republic after the Second Punic War. So Glabrio knew at this point that he was a made man, and that his name would live on for a very long time. However, he wasn't necessarily going to get the credit he thought he deserved. The only thing that could have made the Battle of Thermopylae more comprehensive is if King Antiochus had been captured or killed. As it was, he couldn't even claim to have escaped by the skin of his teeth, since, according to at least one ancient source, all of his teeth were knocked out in the course of the battle. However, despite losing his teeth, he was able to save his life. He escaped to Chalcis, where he had a naval base, and then he was able to sail off to Asia. He did promise to return to Greece. He did send a little bit of money at one point, but he was never able to fulfill his promise to try again for Greece. So this was still a decisive strategic victory. Immediately after the battle, of course, Glabrio and Cato are both joyous. They probably hugged each other or high-fived or whatever the case might be. And Glabrio was so pleased with how Cato had performed that he gave him the honor of traveling back to Rome to announce the victory, with the assumption, naturally enough, that Cato would credit him with the authorship of the victory, since, of course, he was the general in command and the guy who had authorized Cato's maneuver. Meanwhile, while Cato was going off to tell the Senate the good news and to put a bit of a spin on it perhaps, Glabrio pursued the enemy to Chalcis. He thought he might be able to capture Antiochus. He was not. So then he turned back and fought the Aetolians. He also was working hand in hand with Philip V to bring the Aetolians to heel. And while this operation was going on, and we'll talk about the details of it in a minute, news seems to have arrived back at his camp that Cato had told a different version of events than the one that he would have authorized. That Cato was saying that he was the true genius behind the Battle of Third Thermopylae. And so this would begin a quest for credit that the two men would wage for the rest of their respective lives. They absolutely despised each other after this point, because both of them wanted to be the hero of Thermopylae. And it appears that despite the seemingly high stakes of this, both of them got credit. Both of them were very much celebrated for what they had done at Thermopylae, and yet they still remained deeply jealous of the other for having to share that credit. And this is fairly comparable to the battle in the American Revolution between Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold after the Battle of Saratoga, where both of them claimed credit, and for the most part, both of them got credit in their lifetimes at least. So it wasn't necessarily as significant of a conflict as the men involved in it thought it was. With Antiochus on his way to Asia, Glabrio decided that the best way to prevent the Seleucids from returning was to take care of all of their allies so that they would have no one to aid them if they were to make a comeback. And so he first decided to go after the non-Aetolian Greeks who had defected to the Seleucid cause, because he knew that their support would be softer. He also knew that once he invaded the Aetolian heartland, he would be engaged in mountainous warfare, and so he wanted to have a clear line of communication. He didn't want to be in a potentially dangerous area with any threats in the rear. So the Romans and Macedonians began to reduce the various Greeks. Glabrio himself campaigned in Boeotia, which is one of the wealthiest agricultural plains in the Greek world. Boeotia literally means cowland, and the most famous city here, of course, is Thebes. So he was just laying waste to the land until the local elites decided that the Aetolians could fight this war by themselves. Meanwhile, in Thessaly, to the north, Philip V initiated the siege at Lamia, and Glabrio besieged Heraclea. Both of these cities fell pretty quickly, and so by early summer, the combined Roman-Macedonian army marched south and began to threaten Aetolia itself. At this time, Antiochus had sent a message ahead to the Aetolians promising a bunch of money and another army. However, the Aetolians had been a meat shield in the past for the Romans, and so they knew that Antiochus just wanted them to bleed on his behalf. So they decided not to play the game and instead to throw in the towel. And the man tasked with surrendering was none other than the braggadocious general Democritus, a man who had disrespected Flamininus during the Second Macedonian War, and who had also made a lot of chest-thumping threats against Glabrio as well. But now he was on his hands and knees begging for mercy. And he received it, although his credibility and his manhood didn't quite really survive after all of the chest-thumping he had done in the past. Anyway, the war was more or less over at this point, but Glabrio still had some things to do in the Greek world before he decided to go home. By the time that he received the surrender of Democritus, it's safe to say that Glabrio had won the war, although he had not yet won the peace. And so, it now came time to sign a treaty. Glabrio's initial terms for the Aetolians, which they accepted, were for an unconditional surrender. However, as Greeks, they didn't understand the nuances of Roman diplomatic language. So the Romans had played the legalese game during their conquest of Italy. But Flamininus would intervene on behalf of the Aetolians and tell Glabrio that it was unfair to do this with people who were not Latin speakers. And so Glabrio would reluctantly release the Aetolians from these terms. And although Glabrio gave in to Flamininus' pressure and bowed to his claims of authority on this issue, still Flamininus would hold this against him and think that Glabrio was a bit unstable and unreliable. And we have to keep in mind that because Flamininus still was one of the major titans of politics, that his negative assessment of Glabrio's handling of this aspect of the war had a lot of pull back at home. So, once the Aetolians renounced the unconditional surrender because that was not something they were willing to do, the war trundled forward, although again it was still pretty much over because the Aetolians had no chance whatsoever. The Aetolians continued to fight on. Glabrio went after one of the major ports at Naupactus. Meanwhile, Philip V returned north and captured the city of Demetrius. This was a pretty major prize, as it was a major port city and had been a major base for Antiochus III. By the way, one of the controversies is that Glabrio was allowing Philip V to keep all the things he was capturing. So Philip V, who had just been an enemy of Rome earlier in the decade, was regaining most of the major things he had lost because of his rivalry with Rome. So Glabrio was following that old policy of rewarding Roman allies the same way that they had given all kinds of stuff to Pergamon. But, of course, it's more controversial to do so with Philip because of Rome's history with him. So the Roman home government, and due to the influence of Flamininus and the antipathy to Philip, is now becoming relatively hostile to Glabrio's decisions, even though he's simultaneously the hero of the hour. So Glabrio is in a somewhat perilous position in terms of making enemies at a time when their resistance to him will not be able to come forward at the moment, but might be a problem down the line. So Glabrio is sowing the seeds of some later problems. Glabrio and Flamininus had words once again during the siege of Naupactus. Naupactus was one of the major ports, if not the only real port, in Aetolia, and it appears that they had a very basic difference of strategy. Glabrio wanted to simply punish Rome's enemies and reward Rome's friends. So he wanted to empower Philip V and decimate the power of the Aetolian League. However, Flamininus understood that if they were to do that, the Romans would be empowering people who could later challenge them. And so his concern was to maintain a balance of power in Greece so that there would not be a preeminent power that could then challenge them from that quarter again. So this was a fundamental difference in foreign policy, and it was something about which Flamininus felt very passionately. So while Glabrio made concessions to Flamininus's opinion, Flamininus still thought that the man was a complete and total moron, and so their relationship was largely dead, even though, to Glabrio's credit, although his policy was not necessarily wise, he was willing to bend on it. And so, when Flamininus arranged a truce with the Aetolians, and this is kind of stepping on Glabrio's toes more than a little bit, since Glabrio is the proconsul, Glabrio still agreed to honor it. So Glabrio was still giving Flamininus a lot of deference as a Greek expert, even though, again, it actually was his call to make, not Flamininus's. But perhaps because Glabrio knew how much pull Flamininus had back at home with the Senate, he knew that he would have to cave on a number of things. So, although Flamininus set up this truce and the Aetolians sent envoys to Rome, peace was not achieved in 190. The war actually only ended because of Lucius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Asiaticus, the brother of Africanus. He was the next consul, and he was looking to free up men from Glabrio's army to go with him into Asia to fight Antiochus. And so he arranged a second 6-month truce, and that is what led to the eventual negotiations that finally ended the war. So up to this point, although Glabrio has butted heads with a number of people, he has respected the Senate's authority, and he has also respected his colleagues. It's worth mentioning. Now, based on the merits of the debate, I believe that Glabrio's handling of the settlement was pretty inept, but you can't really fault his conduct. So there's not really too much to look at in terms of him going beyond the pale or doing anything that would be against the norms of Roman practice. So he was still respecting the Republic's laws and respecting the opinions of those who disagreed with him. So there's both praise and blame to be allotted here. And I have to say all that because I've studied a lot of the late Republic where generals do tend to go rogue on the regular. So this is quite different than the kinds of rogue behavior we'd see later. The 190s and 180s had perhaps the best command lineup the Romans ever produced. It had the most veteran troops in the ranks, and they won a lot of their greatest victories. Not surprisingly, this means that they also celebrated some of the most magnificent triumphs in the history of the Republic. Perhaps the headliner of Glabrio's triumph was the captured general Democritus. And I'm sure that everyone was well aware at the time that at one point he had actually bragged to Flamininus that one day he would encamp with his army on the Tiber and the Romans would tremble in fear before the greatness of Aetolia. Well, he and some fellow Aetolians did get to camp along the Tiber, but not quite in the same way he had thought they would. So he got to be in Glabrio's triumphal procession along with another commander, Philip of Megalopolis, who had been captured up in Thessaly. He was probably a garrison commander. Now, another interesting note about Glabrio's triumph is that he and his allies had delayed the hearing of the Aetolian embassy that had been sent from Greece by Lucius Scipio. And no doubt this delay was so that the Aetolians would have to watch as the Romans celebrated beating the shit out of them. So the Aetolians sat by while their embarrassed generals were paraded through the streets, and the Romans celebrated their victory over the Aetolians and their Seleucid allies. But being good diplomats, the Aetolians remained professional and got a peace negotiated. This was a great triumph, and it was notable. Everybody who attended no doubt enjoyed it. That being said, Glabrio's triumph was perhaps a little bit bittersweet for him, because he knew that it wasn't quite on the level of the triumph a few years earlier that Titus Flamininus had celebrated. And also, a couple years after this, he would have to sit through Lucius Scipio's triumph for the Battle of Magnesia, where he defeated Antiochus on Asian soil. And that triumph also was more glamorous than his. And so Glabrio probably lived with a little bit of regret that his triumph was not just a little bit better. That being said, again, it was still one hell of a triumph. So it's much better than what most Romans get. But again, this is an age of titans, an age when Rome had some of the most talented and accomplished generals it would ever produce. So the competition was real and it was fierce. Although his triumph was not quite as glamorous as the ones that came immediately before and after it, it still gave him a lot of momentum, and as the victor at Thermopylae, he was one of the best regarded Romans of his generation. So when he put himself forward as a candidate for the censorship in 189, he had a very good chance of victory. However, unfortunately for him, one of the more obscure legates, whose name is not recorded from that campaign, accused him publicly of misappropriating some of the spoils. This legate claimed that Glabrio had spoils hidden in his house. We don't know if that's true or not, so it's unclear whether this was merely an allegation or a fact. But it was either true or at least universally believed. And if so, this is a very damaging thing because this would have been extremely unusual at the time. Roman senators actually tended to follow certain ethical rules at this period. And so the fact that anyone would think this about Glabrio was very damaging. Now, what put the nail in the coffin of his run for the censorship was not that allegation, which was admittedly damaging, but how Cato responded to that allegation. So Cato was also a candidate for censor in 189, and he said that because there might have been irregularity, and he implied that there definitely was, although he used the word might, that he could not taint the process by being involved in such an election for an office as important as the censorship if his integrity was under any suspicion, even indirectly. And so Cato the Elder withdrew his candidacy. And so once Cato withdrew, even though he was not even being accused, Glabrio had no choice but to follow suit. And so neither of them would be censor in 189. However, 5 years later, Cato would be censor. And that would give him one of his nicknames, since that was Cato's favorite position of his career, where he could really legislate morality and punish people who disagreed with him. As for Glabrio, after 189, he is largely inactive, and we don't know exactly what he was up to most of the time. However, what we do know is that he lived for a long time. In fact, 30 years later, he's still alive and well. But his days of running for office and really competing have ended. He's just another senator, albeit one with a big reputation, and no doubt someone who occasionally had old man screaming matches with Cato, since both of them would live well into the 150s and, by all accounts, still despised each other. In the meantime, however, Glabrio would also make some cultural contributions. 35 years after his failed run for the censorship in 154, Glabrio was not only alive, but still at least semi-active, and he got to see his son become suffect consul. Not only that, but the son asked him to cooperate in a joint venture. So the father-son duo built a temple dedicated to piety. Now, the Romans' understanding of piety was more about respecting one's family and one's ancestors, rather than, say, being humble or really lowering yourself in the presence of the gods. So it should come as no surprise, given this Roman understanding of what piety was, that Glabrio decided that the best way to show respect to himself, and something that his descendants could really relate to, would be to put up a golden statue of himself. And so Glabrio became the very first Roman to put up a golden statue of himself, something that was actually relatively common in the Hellenistic East. And this apparently started a trend, at least if the 4th century CE historian Ammianus Marcellinus is to be believed. Once Glabrio took that step, everybody followed. And no doubt, given Cato's antipathy to all things Greek, this was something that he was really incensed by. So it's a pretty good bet, actually, that one of the motives that impelled Glabrio to put this statue up was just to get in one last shot against Cato. So this was his last act, and it was probably a pretty effective one if his goal was to piss off his old enemy. In his own time, Manius Acilius Glabrio was never the first man in Rome, but he was always in the running. And that would largely remain true for many of his descendants. They would not enjoy unbroken success every generation, but they were never that far from power either. A later Manius Acilius Glabrio was a pretty prominent player in the late Republic, having presided as praetor over the infamous trial of Gaius Verres before becoming consul in 67. Much later, the paranoid Emperor Domitian had an Acilius Glabrio exiled and then killed because he suspected that man of plotting treason. And much like many of the earlier emperors, Domitian was very afraid of people who had pedigrees that stretched back into the Republic. And that's why, by the end of Domitian's reign, very few old families that had existed prior to Caesar and Octavian were still around. Acilius Glabrio was one of the few lines that managed to survive. There's later a Marcus Acilius Glabrio who becomes consul in 256, and I believe that he's the last to bear the Acilius Glabrio name and reach the consulship. That being said, there are other descendants of Manius Acilius Glabrio who bear some or all of his name. There is the Acilius Aviola branch that is prominent in Roman politics from the 1st to 3rd centuries. And then the last two major players, or three in this case, you have an Anicius Acilius Glabrio Faustus, who becomes Praetorian Prefect in 442. That was an office where this person effectively ran the bureaucracy and funded the armies. And then you have that man's two grandsons, who had dropped the Glabrio name, but still were bearers of this line, and both of them would serve as consuls in the 480s, this time under the Ostrogoths, because by this point Romulus Augustulus had been deposed. And so technically, the Acilius Glabrio name, or at least the descendants of Acilius Glabrio in this case, would actually survive the Republic itself. So Acilius Glabrio's fame should never be underestimated. And I have to say that his either name or his genetic line, it's sometimes unclear exactly how much of the genetics survived due to the adoption practices the Romans had, but this name certainly proved to be very durable. So of all the great Romans of the Middle Republic, it's interesting that only one of their names made it to the very end of the empire, and that name was Acilius Glabrio. Manius Acilius Glabrio was never the greatest Roman alive. That being said, he still managed to become one of the most significant Romans to ever live. His actions in the war with the Seleucids were pivotal for winning the war. He prevented Antiochus III from simply taking Greece and potentially going on to achieve his lifelong goal of restoring the Seleucid Empire and reuniting all of what Alexander had once controlled. So, in this way, he helped to put the Seleucids on a path to decline. He also made sure the Romans were in a great position to follow up his great victory at Thermopylae and win the war, which left Rome as the only superpower in the Mediterranean. So, his role in this war is often overshadowed by what happened later under Scipio Asiaticus. But, still, what he achieved is quite significant. And at the time when he landed, the Romans really didn't know exactly what to expect. They knew that Antiochus hadn't necessarily landed a massive army, but at the same time, they knew he had a lot of troops in Asia, and they didn't know when or if he was going to bring more of them. So his operation was risky. Let's not let how it turned out influence our thinking too much. When he landed, it was very much a risk, and there was a chance of a Roman defeat. Not to mention, of course, that Antiochus won way more battles than he lost, and in fact hadn't lost a battle in about 20 years by the time he fought and lost at Third Thermopylae. Now, Acilius Glabrio was never the greatest man of his lifetime because he happened to be a contemporary of Scipio Africanus, Titus Flamininus, and Cato the Elder. And if those are your competitors, you would be pretty proud to finish fourth, and that's exactly what Glabrio did. It appears that of those three men, he might have had a somewhat functional relationship with Scipio Africanus, and that's about it. Because obviously, while he was willing to pay respect to Titus Flamininus, the two men did not get along. They did not share the same vision of the war. Flamininus stepped all over his feet when he was trying to settle the issue with the Aetolians, and Flamininus, by his behavior, clearly thought that Glabrio was a complete clown. As for Cato the Elder, we've already talked about how Cato and Glabrio were bitter enemies, and they feuded for the rest of their lives over who was the true victor at Third Thermopylae. To be fair, of course, Cato had many bitter rivalries, and Glabrio was not even the most significant one, because Cato was also a determined foe for Scipio. And while it is not quite as world historical as the Battle of Third Thermopylae, Glabrio did set a new standard in Rome. So because of Rome's sort of reaching into the Greek world, many Romans were becoming more Hellenized, especially elite Romans who admired Greek culture. And so Glabrio's decision to put up a gold statue of himself was something that was very un-Roman, and yet it would quickly become standard for the Romans. Moralists like Cato would no doubt have called this Eastern excess, and yet Glabrio had clearly long since ceased to care what Cato had to say about anything. And so he put up the statue, and this display became normal. So every Roman after this, if the fact that Ammianus was still aware of who had first done it, a lot of Romans would have still remembered that the reason they were putting up a statue like this is because that's what Glabrio had done. And of course, while perhaps it is more impressive to shine brightly rather than for a long time, Gens Aquilia was the longest lasting of the Roman gens so far as we know. So of all the gentes ever, none lasted longer than Aquilia. And it was built fundamentally on the fame of Manius Acilius Glabrio, the consul of 191. So all of the many men who followed him and became consul or otherwise gained distinction in the Roman world could look back with pride on his golden statue and his victory at Thermopylae, which only owed a little bit to Cato the Elder from their perspective. So, until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Patreon as well, and all of that fun stuff. I will see you in the near future with more Romans of Renown and other content as well. Take care.